My name is Paul Hercock. I'm proud to be the Chief Executive Officer of Mdr Systems. I spent many years working as a medical doctor, and then I've been in the medical device industry for more than 7 years, focusing primarily on the use and application of clinical evidence to support medical device regulatory approvals, both in Europe and elsewhere. The aim for today is to gain a detailed overview of the MDR, and through that to understand the key requirements for building an MDR compliance strategy, making sure that your products are supported by the regulatory framework they need. So another objective is to enable you to have confidence in assembling those regulatory systems and ensuring they will meet an MDR standard. We're also going to talk about how we can use what can be quite onerous regulatory obligations to your wider advantage, including commercial advantage and in other ways as well. We're also going to talk specifically about the generation and interpretation of clinical evidence in supporting MDR submissions. As will be discussed, this is really central to a successful MDR submission. And we're also going to signpost you to some powerful resources and personal support that are available to make sure that your MDR strategy is a success. It's very difficult to talk about an MDR strategy unless we have a detailed understanding of the MDR as a piece of legislation. Now, it's 175 pages long. It's quite difficult to digest. And this slide on screen now is an attempt to decant all of that into a need-to-know level of information. And the message is that the MDR puts obligations on in 3 domains: manufacturers, notified bodies, and member states. So if we take those in reverse, what we mean by a member state, of course, are the countries that are part of the European Union. And the MDR until recently had or was scheduled to have direct application in the UK, but of course that's now changed. Member states are obliged to set up a competent authority, which is a body that has overall responsibility for medical device regulation in their country. They're also obliged to contribute towards a database called UDMED, which in truth is still not fully operational, but will become so over the coming years. And member states are also obliged to interact with other member states in the event of a medical device catastrophe or major problem that is important for others to know about. An example of which would be historical problems in relation to metal on metal hip implants or breast implants. Notified bodies, as most people will know, are companies that have been authorized by competent authorities to perform conformity assessments of medical devices. And although this webinar doesn't concern obligations of notified bodies directly, everything that is done by a medical device manufacturer, certainly with the exception of Class 1 devices, will be scrutinized by a notified body. Most of this webinar, however, will focus on obligations for medical device manufacturers. And you can see a number of systems on the left-hand side of this slide that medical device manufacturers need to put in place. And we're going to talk shortly about how to decant this into a more logical workflow that can help you ensure that all of these areas have been addressed. Alongside the systems themselves, the medical device manufacturer also, of course, needs to produce a medical device, as well as a suite of technical documentation and a particularly important piece of technical documentation called a clinical evaluation report, CER, which we'll talk about later on. To move away from that rather theoretical framework into a more pragmatic workflow, I'd like to introduce this slide, which will form the backbone of the remainder of the webinar. And it's intended for anyone who has a new medical device, but it's also intended for anyone who works in a company that has devices that have been approved under the MDD, but are partway through the transition to compliance with the MDR. And although some of these questions seem extremely basic, because there have been changes in the way things are defined and classified under the MDR compared to the MDD, it's still important to follow this workflow logically when performing an MDR transition. So let's make a start with the first box. Is your product a medical device? Again, it seems like a very straightforward question, but as we'll see in a moment, it's perhaps not quite as straightforward as it used to be. The rules for determining whether a product is a medical device are contained in Article 2 of the MDR, and we have a representation of the definition here on screen. And like most definitions in legal text, it's quite long, quite cumbersome. But the message from this is the definition is extremely broad, and it includes software, hardware, liquids, reagents, and other articles. The words other article leaves things very open-ended. And there's provisions in relation to disease, injury, physiological or pathological states, and even within certain limitations, in vitro examination of specimens. The important thing is to go through this definition methodically and see if it applies to your products, and also to consider the exceptions which apply to this core definition. At the bottom, you can see that anything which does achieve its principal intended action by pharmacological, immunological, or metabolic means would be excluded from this definition. So it wouldn't extend to drugs or immunological modification products, etc. There are some other important constraints on this definition which are not contained in the Article 2. These are contained elsewhere in the MDR, such as the introduction. So any products that contain viable tissues or cells of human or animal origin are not covered by the MDR. And there's been an expansion in the number of devices that do contain viable tissues or cells as technology advances. There's some confusion caused by provisions in relation to in vitro diagnostic devices. Primarily, in vitro diagnostic devices are now covered by a separate piece of legislation, which is Regulation 2017-746. But any that do not fall into the definition in 746 could be covered by the MDR. So if you have a product that straddles those two worlds, the important thing is to work through the definition in 2017-746 first. Another interesting thing that's been introduced by the MDR is an extension to some products that don't have a primary intended medical purpose. These include some cosmetic products, and there's a complete list of these products in Annex 16 to the MDR. So for the first time, we're seeing products that were never really intended to be a medical device being covered by medical device legislation. Things are further compounded because it's not uncommon nowadays for a product to be a combination of a device and a drug. So an example might be an orthopedic cement that secretes gentamicin. And so combination products can cause some challenges in terms of where they fit in the legislation. The key thing is to consider what the primary intended purpose of the product is. And of course, as a manufacturer, you have some control over that. In the example of a bone cement containing gentamicin, its primary intended purpose would be to act as a grout between bone and implant, and the action of the gentamicin would be secondary or ancillary, and it would therefore be a device rather than a drug. Once we've navigated the Article 2 definition and we're confident we are working with a medical device, we can move on to consider which risk classification the device falls into. Again, for those of you that already have products out there in the market, this may seem very basic, but it's important to remember that the risk classifications of some products have changed under the MDR, and there's new provisions been introduced which will alter risk classification as well. Rules for risk classification are contained in Annex 8 of the MDR. There are 4 risk classes of medical device: Class 1, Class 2A, Class 2B, and Class 3, and that's in ascending order of risk to patients and also of level of scrutiny that will be performed on regulatory processes and documents. So Class 1 products are those that carry the least risk to patients. An example on screen is that of a tongue depressor. And Class 3 are those that are normally permanently implantable devices, or those that carry potentially very high risk and require a greater level of scrutiny. Annex 8 takes a little bit of getting used to. If people have worked with it before, then that's fine. But for people that are new to this, we actually have a video on how to work with Annex 8 that's available in our YouTube channel. This presentation will be made available to you as a PDF after the webinar, and all of the links, such as the one there for the video, will be live links. So you can find the resources that are signposted in this presentation following the webinar. Just a couple of notes on working with Annex 8. Always remember that the end of the Annex contains a number of special rules that don't follow the general flow of the main body of the rules. They're a bit of a hodgepodge, and it's important to make sure that these are considered because they can upgrade the risk classification of a product. A specific mention about Rule 11 in relation to software as a medical device. Software is interesting in that it can actually fall into any of the risk classifications, and so it's important if you have a software product to consider Rule 11 in detail. Rule 21 is an entirely new provision introduced by the MDR, and it relates to devices that are composed of substances, and the words used are intended to be introduced to the body via a body orifice or applied to the skin, and that are absorbed or locally dispersed. So many such products, such as emollients or similar, would have been a Class 1 device prior to the MDR, but under Rule 21, they may well be upgraded to a Class 2A or Class 2B device. In the event of a conflict between two possible rule classifications, it's important to note that the highest possible classification will always apply. So following the workflow forward, having established that we do indeed have a medical device, we now know which risk classification it falls into. The next job is to consider the Annex 1 General Safety and Performance Requirements, because the combination of the first three blocks here will enable you to understand your core obligations under the MDR. So what are the General Safety Performance Requirements? Well, they replace the essential requirements in the Medical Device Directive, and they're a list of statutory requirements that a product must demonstrate conformity with to the extent that they apply to a device. And they are in addition to any obligations that may flow from the intended purpose that you as a manufacturer can determine in relation to the product. So you have control over the intended purpose, but you don't have control over the general safety performance requirements that are relevant to your device. So they're a very long list, and the first job is to work through Annex 1 and understand which of the general safety performance requirements do and do not apply to your device. That can be quite tricky and is subject to a high degree of interpretation. And for that reason, once again, we have a video on working with MDR Annex 1 that can be found using the link at the bottom of the page when you get the PDF after the webinar. The important thing to note is that any of the general safety performance requirements that are relevant to your device, for all of them, it's necessary to produce evidence of conformity. So you need to show that your device conforms to all of the GSPRs that are relevant to it. The message is to start early. If you have a new product that's pre-market, make sure you've gone through the general safety performance requirements, because it will tell you what your device needs to do. And it may well have important inputs into the design process, choice of materials, the way it interacts with the user and so on, that if it's an early stage device, it will be more convenient to incorporate now rather than later on. In terms of evidencing conformity to general safety performance requirements, clinical evidence will often be required, which we'll talk about later. But the other thing that's possible is to use harmonized standards and recognized standards for the more technical general safety performance requirements, for example, in reference to biocompatibility or choice of materials and so on. So it's certainly worth compiling a list of harmonized standards that may have relevance to your product. So as discussed, once you've established that you have a medical device, you understand the risk classification that it falls into, and you've performed a proper analysis of the Annex 1 General Safety Performance Requirements. Essentially, you then have in mind some core MDR obligations, which will guide the passage through the remainder of the workflow and will constitute the core of some of the important technical documents that you'll need to put together in relation to the device. Following this stage, we now need to go through each of the major systems that need to be in place in relation to an MDR strategy. And to do that, we'll start with the first one, which is a quality management system. For all of these systems we've referenced on this slide, what we consider to be the best source of core information about each of the systems. So in this case, for example, MDR Article 10 contains actually very useful information about expectations for quality management systems. Article 10 is one of the more accessible articles in the MDR and is worth reading in full. So I certainly suggest that you do that. The other important source of information in relation to quality management is the ISO standard 13485/2016. And ISO 13485 is an example of a harmonized standard. So if you can demonstrate that you have a quality management system that conforms with 13485, it will be presumed that your quality management system also complies with the respective provisions in the MDR. One thing to note is that ISO 13485 has not yet been updated. The most recent edition was in 2016, so there are some slight differences between the MDR expectations and the processes set out in the ISO standard, but broadly speaking, it remains the standard to work to. So let's just look at quality management systems in a little bit more detail. Again, there'll be some on the call for which this is familiar, but for others, this might be a new and challenging area. A quality management system is a formalized system that sets out processes, responsibilities, and procedures. And the objective is to ensure and continuously improve the quality of business activities. Quality management, of course, is not unique to medical devices. It applies across manufacturing and many other sectors, but we're really talking about a very specific application of quality management here. And as mentioned before, it's set out in Article 10 and ISO 13485/2016. For any early stage companies that are on the call, one thing I would signpost is that ISO standards can be very expensive depending on where you buy them from. But over the years we've been involved in this industry, we found out that the Estonian Standards Agency, for which there's a URL at the bottom of the slide, they sell the official English language version of ISO standards at about 10% the cost that they'd be available through BSI or elsewhere. So ISO 13485 will be over €200 from BSI, but is less than €20 for a single user license from the Estonian Standards Agency. So we're not on commission, it's just some friendly advice. If you need to buy any ISO standards and would like to save some money, that's a very good place to go. Quality management systems can be complex, and one of the things we try to do at Mantra Systems is to reduce things to a level of simplicity. So this slide will show a way of thinking about quality management and how it divides into its various different functions. So the first division is into wider company quality control measures and post-market surveillance. So a lot of people don't realize that post-market surveillance is actually part of a quality management system, certainly in medical devices. And we're going to come on to post-market surveillance in some detail in a moment. Wider company quality control measures can apply to almost any action across the company. So this would include, for example, information security, controlling access to physical premises, choosing third-party suppliers, choosing materials, how things are stored, and so on. They might not be directly related to medical devices in the flesh, but all these activities can have a bearing ultimately on the quality and standard of products that are produced, and so they're still caught by ISO 13485. It's common to find company quality control measures expressed in a quality manual, which sets out an overall strategy for quality management within an organization, and a set of policies or standard operating procedures that set out actions, responsibilities, roles for very specific parts of quality management. So an example before was information security. There might be reference to an overall information security strategy in the quality manual, but there'd be a specific SOP or policy that relates to information security specifically. We're not going to talk much further about the wider company quality control measures in this webinar. We're going to focus primarily on the post-market surveillance arm. And so when it comes to this workflow, the reality is that really we should have illuminated two of these bubbles, quality management systems and post-market surveillance together, because as we discussed, post-market surveillance is part of a company's quality management system. The rules for post-market surveillance are contained in Article 84 of the MDR. So let's talk about post-market surveillance in a little bit more detail. So it's the process of monitoring the safety of a medical device after its release onto the market. It deals with CE marked devices. A key difference between post-market surveillance and quality management is that quality management will apply across the whole organization, whereas each post-market surveillance system, at least in theory, is specific to an individual device or family of devices if they're closely related to one another. So that's an important way to understand the distinction between the two. Post-market surveillance is all about a proactive collection and review of experience with the device. How is it performing? Is it safe? Is it meeting with expectations? Do we need to change anything about the device? Do we need to alter its indications? Do we need to change the information that's been released with the device? If you have a pre-market device, you may be thinking, well, this doesn't have any relevance to us because we can't possibly collect post-market surveillance data on a pre-market device. And that will be true. But one thing I would say is that if you are pre-market, now is the time to start writing a Pms Plan, because that will be necessary in order to get a CE mark, but it will also potentially highlight any challenges that you may come across down the line in terms of collecting data in relation to your device. It may help inform the design of other systems such as post-market clinical follow-up, which we're going to move on to in a moment. So start early with the Pms Plan. Post-market surveillance can be thought of as having two arms. That's post-market clinical follow-up, PMCF, and vigilance. We're going to talk slightly more about those in a moment. And as mentioned before, PMS is specific to a device or a family of devices. There are some important documents that need to be produced in relation to a post-market surveillance system. One is the Pms Plan, which we just mentioned. This sets out a strategy for how data will be collected in relation to the device. And then periodically, it will be necessary to collate the results of post-market surveillance activities and reduce them to a technical document. And the name of that document will depend on the risk classification of the device. If you have a class 1 device, that document will be called a PMS report, and it will be a relatively simple summary of data that's been compiled from a post-market surveillance system. For any other class of device, so that's class 2A, class 2B, or class 3, the document will be called a periodic safety update report, PSUR, and that's a more detailed version of a PMS report. As you'd expect for a higher risk classification, it reflects a higher level of scrutiny that will be that the device will be subjected to. Post-market surveillance is a big area, and really we don't have time available on this webinar to go into it in as much detail as we'd like. So what we've done is we've compiled a white paper on post-market surveillance in the MDR, and that's free to download. Once again, there'll be an active link in the PDF version of this presentation that you'll receive, so you can get a copy of our white paper on post-market surveillance. So jumping back into this, you can see, as we mentioned before, that post-market surveillance has two arms. One is post-market clinical follow-up, and one is vigilance. If we take vigilance first, vigilance, I suppose, can be thought of as the bad news arm of post-market surveillance. This is all about collecting complaints, adverse events, serious adverse events, and it also concerns responses to serious adverse events. So if there's a serious adverse event in relation to a device, that must be reported to the relevant competent authority. In the UK, that would be the MHRA. And the competent authority may well say to the manufacturer, okay, you need to do something about that. That do something is normally something called a field safety corrective action, FSCA. And that's really just an action that's designed to prevent that serious adverse event happening again. Sometimes you'll see a reference to an FSN, which is a field safety notice. And that really is the way in which the action is being communicated to users of the product out there in the market. All of that falls under vigilance, and vigilance would also extend to things like scrutiny of national or international databases of adverse events in relation to medical devices. So in the US, the FDA manage a database called MDR, which is almost a free-for-all database compiling adverse events. A good practice is certainly to scrutinize the MDR database for any adverse events that may have occurred in relation to your device, but also any that may have occurred in relation to any similar devices because anything that affects a similar device may well have an overspill effect or a potential overspill effect to your device. So scrutiny of those databases and the other things we mentioned would all fall under vigilance. And vigilance can be thought of mostly as a reactive system. If you're very lucky, you may receive no complaints at all and no adverse events. So vigilance may return no or very little data depending on how the device is performing. In contrast to that is post-market clinical follow-up. This is a more proactive arm of post-market surveillance. And really, if it's set up properly, it will always return some information. And PMCF has attained much higher importance under the MDR than it ever had under the MDD. So it's something we focus on a lot at Mantra Systems, and it's something we need to look at in a little bit more detail in the context of this webinar. So returning to this workflow, again, a way of thinking about this is that when we talk about quality management systems, we're also talking about post-market surveillance, and by extension, we're talking about post-market clinical follow-up, because they're all linked to one another. And in fact, everything on this workflow, if done properly, will link to everything else. But as we've discussed, specifically in terms of the hierarchy and how things are organized, PMCF is ultimately part of the quality management system. Annex 14 Part B of the MDR contains actually quite a useful summary of expectations in relation to PMCF. And it's quite a short annex and it's worth reading in detail. So what is post-market clinical follow-up? It's a continuous process, and it concerns proactive collection and evolution of clinical data in relation to how a device is performing. And the important thing is that it's done properly. It should collect safety and performance data throughout the entire lifetime of a medical device. Often people think of post-market clinical follow-up as just another clinical study, but normal clinical studies will not meet that criterion for data collection throughout the entire device's lifetime, or the device's entire lifetime, I should say. Because if you consider a standard randomized control trial, for example, that would collect data for a specific period of time on a defined patient population under certain controlled conditions. That won't work for PMCF. What we're talking about with PMCF is ongoing data collection on representative uses of the device at centres across the spectrum, from small cottage centres to super specialised units. So it's a very different type of data collection, and it needs a different type of system in order to ensure that those criteria are met. Data points for post-market clinical follow-up, if done properly, should be informed by risk management files that have been compiled in relation to the device, and informed by any previous clinical evaluations that have been conducted. The overall message of PMCF in the MDR is that it's intended to resolve any residual uncertainty in relation to the device. So the immediate question from that is, what happens if you have a very, very well-established device that's been in the market for decades or longer, with almost no ongoing questions about safety or performance? Naturally, do I need it? Do all devices need post-market clinical follow-up? So the answer is no. Not all devices do need PMCF, and if you do have one of those very, very well-established devices where there are no reasonable uncertainties remaining about its safety and performance, then PMCF may not be required in relation to that device. The cost requirements for PMCF under the MDR are not straightforward. We've built another resource into our website, which is our Pmcf Checker, which is free to use, and it's just a ready reckoner to see if your device may need PMCF, 10 simple questions. And once again, the section on the bottom of this slide will be a live link in the PDF to take you straight through to that tool. This slide shows another way of thinking about what the requirements are for PMCF under the MDR. These are some of the things that a successful PMCF system will collect data and information on. Existing and new side effects need to be analysed on an ongoing basis. What we're looking for is any changes in how often side effects are arising and how severe they are should they arise. For those of you that are familiar with how risk management works, you can see automatically that that information will feed straight back into your risk management files, which in many cases are built on assumptions about probability and severity of harms. Adverse events. Information about adverse events should also be collected through post-market clinical follow-up. And here you can see the direct overlap, intentional overlap between PMCF and Vigilance, because as you'll recall, adverse events are also collected by Vigilance systems, but that overlap is intentional. By having two different ways of collecting the same important data points, a comprehensive system can more readily ensure that adverse events are unlikely to be missed. Systematic misuse. This is an interesting one. As a clinician myself, I can say confidently that a lot of devices out there on the market are systematically misused. They're used in ways that were never intended by the manufacturer. A device that has one particular role can be repurposed for something else. I used to quite regularly use a small tool, which I believe was actually a gynecology tool, a small metal rod with a little hoop on the end. And if I deformed that with some pliers or similar, it became a very useful tool for taking beads out of children's ears. So systematic misuse is extremely common, and the MDR obliges manufacturers to find a way to collect information about where their device has been systematically misused. That can actually be very useful, not just to meet your regulatory obligations, but you may find potentially a new indication for your product that you hadn't considered. And so PMCF can really add value to your commercial offering if done properly. A successful PMCF system will also collect information about new or emergent risks which haven't been considered in existing risk management files. So if well designed, it will have enough flexibility to absorb any new risks which haven't been thought about before. But really what we're talking about is an overall assessment of the performance of the device in normal use, and that's the key word, normal use, not experimental use. We're not seeking to compare this device to any other devices. It's just about how does it function in the hands of the normal user. And so really what we're looking at is real world evidence. And as I said before, this is very different to the type of data that you get from normal clinical trials. And so PMCF needs a specific type of design under the MDR to work properly. There's a number of documents, technical documents that need to be produced in relation to PMCF. For those of you that have a pre-market device, I would give early thought to developing a PMCF plan. The MDCG, the Medical Device Commissioning Group, produce quite useful guidelines which can help with constructing some of the technical documents. And MDCG 2020-7 is free to download and gives a template for putting together a PMCF plan. So that's definitely worth working with directly. PMCF, as I mentioned, will often involve a type of clinical investigation. And the important thing to remember is that MDR Annex 15 contains specific rules for the conduct of any and all clinical investigations of medical devices. And that would include those that are performed for PMCF. So you need to have an understanding of MDR Annex 15 in order to put together the other documents that will support a PMCF system. So that would include a clinical investigation plan or protocol, which sets out exactly how the study will be conducted, an investigator's brochure, which gives specific instructions for principal investigators at clinical sites, and other documents such as consent forms and ethics submissions. As we'll come on to in a moment, this is a core area for us at Mantra Systems, and we offer a full range of support for designing PMCF systems, writing PMCF plans, and developing clinical investigation documents. After a PMCF system has been running for a period of time, you're also obliged to compile a PMCF report that will assimilate and analyze the data that's been collected through operation of the PMCF system. So PMCF, we're going to come back to at the end of this presentation and talk about some of the support that we can offer to help you meet those actually quite challenging obligations for PMCF under the MDR. The next part of our core workflow is risk management. We've already discussed how different parts of these different systems will cross over and integrate with one another. We've talked about how PMCF can provide data that's useful to risk management on an ongoing basis. But let's talk about risk management specifically so that we can round off that conversation. The most useful source of information in terms of how to put together a risk management system is another ISO standard, which is 14971/2019. And you can see from the year there that this, unlike 13485, has been upgraded or updated to the MDR standard. And so you can be confident that if you're working with 14971/2019, your risk management system is in line with MDR expectations. And on screen here, we have the definition of risk management taken straight from that ISO standard. It's a set of measures for the systematic identification, analysis, assessment, monitoring, and control of risks. And as I mentioned before, ISO standards can be very expensive, but this one is also available from the Estonian Standards Agency. And if you haven't got a copy of the standard, it's well worth investing 20 euros in from there. Risk management done properly involves several principles or stages which should be worked through systematically to make sure that the risk management system as a whole meets with expectations. These steps are risk analysis, which can be thought of as identifying risks, risk estimation, how bad are they, risk evaluation, how happy are we with our analysis of how bad they are, risk control, which is how are we going to mitigate any of those risks that perhaps need mitigating, and benefit risk analysis. What does the overall picture look like? So let's consider each of those in turn. So risk analysis or risk identification, done properly, this should begin at the very beginning of a device's lifetime, even at the back of a BMAT stage. So no matter where you are in terms of a device's journey, it's important to begin the ideation process thinking about risks or harms that could occur in relation to the device. And at the beginning, it really is just a case of just using your imagination to think about what different harms might be. And it's useful to split them into different domains. There's some examples on screen, but these are not the only ones. Risks that may relate to how a user interacts with a device, risks flowing directly from the way a device is designed, electrical risks, those relating to storage or transportation, mechanical risks, physical risks. Another big area under the MDR is post-production risks. So those that will only come into operation once the device is actually been made, any that relate to the process of manufacture and packaging and so on. So it's as broad in scope as you could imagine. If you are at the risk identification stage, another useful source of data is the literature, because similar products out there in the world may have published data on risks that have arisen in relation to their use. So best practice would be to incorporate those into your own risk management files. The standard thing to do is to take that initial ideation or risk identification and to plug it into a table which will look similar to the one on the screen. This is sometimes known as a failure mode effects analysis. And there's some flexibility in how this is constructed, but the one on screen borrows from the suggested structure in ISO 14971. And you can see that it can be split into different domains, user, design, and so on, but also vertically split into hazard, failure cause, hazardous situation, and harm. A harm is something that actually affects a patient, and a risk is the product of a harm and its severity and probability, which we'll come on to in a moment. A hazard is something that can be thought of as being in the background, and something needs to happen to a hazard in order to create a hazardous situation. So we've got some examples on screen. If we look towards the bottom, a hazard might relate to the control system of the device. The failure cause might be that controls are insufficiently mapped to actions. So a user thinks it's going to do one thing and the device does something else. So the hazardous situation is a failure to accurately respond to the user, resulting in an example in an inability to control bleeding, and the harm that would cause the patient is hemorrhage. So it's a step-by-step process. One way I think about it is to start with the harm and work backwards, almost acting as a child. Why? The next step is to estimate and evaluate. So for each harm that's been identified, what we're really thinking about here is what's the probability that the hazardous situation that precedes it will in fact turn into that harm, and how severe would that harm be should it manifest. So there's lots of different ways of doing this, but really we're mapping probability against severity. And some example criteria are on screen. Probability, it might be that you have data available to feed the probability there. You might have sold 100,000 devices, and if a harm has only happened once, then you have reasonable cause for arguing the probability will be 1 on this scale. You might not have access to that information, so that becomes a risk estimation, and really it's just a case of using reasonable best judgment and then building systems that enable you to test that assumption, and really that would be your clinical evidence generation processes, especially your PMCF. Severity might range from negligible to death, with a scale in between. Again, the ones on screen are not set in stone, but are useful working examples. And by mapping one against the other, you can set out where a harm would be acceptable, or where a risk would be acceptable, where it would be moderate, and where it would be severe and unacceptable. And anything in the moderate or severe, the orange or the red zones, would need mitigating. There would need to be something done to the way the device functions or interacts with the user to reduce the probability and or severity of that harm. And in practical terms, it can be difficult to reduce the severity. So usually it's a case of reducing the probability of a hazardous situation becoming a harm. And by feeding that back into the grid framework that we met before, you can start compiling a list of harms, severities, and probabilities. And using a method of analysis that needs to be documented in the risk management plan, you can very easily identify which are acceptable and which are not acceptable. For those that are not acceptable, there needs to be a mitigation, a risk control measure implemented. And there's some examples of those on the screen. Again, these are fictional examples, so they don't relate to anything in particular. Overall, what we're really saying when we come to the benefit risk analysis is, are the risks acceptable? Have they been mitigated as far as possible? And of course, after mitigation, it's reasonable to reperform a probability and severity analysis to see if that probability has come down and the risk now falls into the acceptable part of the grid that we met a couple of slides ago. So are risks acceptable? And is there a clinical evidence of a benefit resulting from use of the device? That would come from the clinical data that's been generated with regard to the device, and we'll come on to data generation in a moment. As part of benefit risk, we're asking, do benefits relating from the device outweigh each individual risk? And do the overall benefits outweigh the overall risks associated with use of the device? Two related but slightly different questions. And a final important question is, has the risk mitigation process itself generated any new risks which were not considered before? So if the risk mitigation process changes the way a device interacts with its user, has that in itself created any new risks? So there needs to be a loop where you go back into the risk analysis process if you make any changes. Just a word about documentation. Risk management needs to be quite well documented. So a risk management plan sets out an overall strategy for conducting risk management. That often relates specifically to a device or a family of devices, but it can apply across the whole organization. That's not unreasonable, because the next provision is to have a risk management file in relation to each individual device. Under the ISO 14971 2019 framework, a risk management file is often a very simple document that just signposts to information held elsewhere. That's perfectly reasonable. Another document that we've already met is an FMEA, which is the grid of hazards, failure causes, hazardous situations, harms, probabilities, severities, and mitigation measures. If you performed any risk control or mitigation activities, it's good practice to document each of those in an individual risk control document. On this slide, we mentioned design input documentation, and this underlines how important it is to start conducting risk management early in the life of a device, because a risk mitigation may result in a design input. It may actually guide how the device needs to be designed. And of course, if you have a mature device, that can be a lot more difficult. But if you have a developmental device, performing risk management activities early on can help you decide on specific design features in the finished product. Ultimately, a risk management report will need to be produced in relation to each device. But of course, that can only be done once the system has been developed and has been running for a period of time. As we mentioned before, best practice is to use your risk analysis to guide design decisions. And the ISO standard sets out a hierarchy of methods for controlling risks. The preference is to have an inherently safe design where, to all intents and purposes, it's impossible for a harm to manifest. In other words, it's just been designed out of the product. That's the top of the hierarchy. If that's not possible, it's reasonable to implement a warning, so an audible or visual warning or something similar to prevent the harm coming to bear, or the lower end of the hierarchy is simply to inform the user, perhaps with something in the instructions for use. But it's preferable to try and aim for an inherently safe design, or at very least a warning, before resorting to having to inform the user. The great thing about using risk analysis early on in the design is it becomes relatively straightforward to justify the device's design to regulators, because you can simply point back to the initial risk management and the design input documents and show that the design of the product is risk-based. As we mentioned before, risk management also informs the design of Pmcf systems. A good Pmcf system will collect data specifically on any risks that were initially moderate or severe in character, or where there's any ongoing uncertainty about the probability or severity of a harm arising. The message is start early. Just a word about implementing risk management in your company. It can be very difficult to undertake risk management if this is a new area. And we gave this a lot of thought at Mantra Systems. Some of our competitors will happily provide consultant support at great expense to build your risk management files for you. But we don't think that's a cost-effective way to implement risk management. So I want to introduce to you something we'll be launching over the next month or so, which is our Mantra Systems Academy. And this is a new initiative with the objective to empower you to perform all necessary risk management activities in-house. In other words, we'll give you training, tools, document templates, progressive examples, and hands-on support, so that instead of just giving you the finished risk management system, we'll give you the capability to build it in-house yourselves without needing to recruit anyone else. And of course, once that knowledge and capability is in place, it can be done for any number of future products as well. So it's a single investment for a lifetime of reward, and it's a dedicated and unique program. This will be launching, our objective is to launch in August this year, and we're offering some early adopter discounts and bonuses for the first few people. So if you're interested in learning more or pre-registering for our Risk Management Academy program, there's an email address at the bottom of the slide. So let's move on to clinical evidence. The truth of the matter is that working with clinical evidence is a core requirement for working with the MDR. The importance of proof of safety and performance is far greater now than it was under the MDD. So it's important to understand clinical evidence from two sides: how to generate it and how to interpret it. And in this section, we're going to talk about principles for generating clinical evidence under the MDR. As I mentioned previously, Annex 15 contains a very useful summary of rules for building and implementing clinical investigations of medical devices under the MDR, and Annex 15 is worth reading in full. So what's evidence for? Well, under the MDR, it's required to demonstrate a number of different things. Evidence of conformity to the relevant general safety performance requirements. Absolutely essential. And so this is where the importance of an early GSPR analysis comes into play, because it will directly inform what clinical evidence needs to be generated in relation to the device. Another thing is evidence of suitability for the device's intended purpose. As a manufacturer, you have control over the intended purpose, So by extension, you have some control over the type of clinical evidence that will need to be generated. In order to perform a benefit risk assessment, it will be necessary to compile evidence of a clinical benefit that results from use of the product. And once again, this just comes from a good clinical evidence generation strategy. And the final domain is in performance of the device against safety and performance benchmarks that have been established from a review of the literature relating to comparable alternative devices that do fundamentally the same thing. If you have a hip replacement and all of your competitors in the same space have a 7% revision rate at 15 years, that's the benchmark for your device. You have to produce evidence that the performance of your device is in line with that benchmark. In the context of this seminar, we're talking about clinical evidence extending to preclinical and clinical evidence. So preclinical evidence is important. It may relate to biocompatibility testing or other forms of pre-release testing. And clinical evidence, strictly speaking, relates to evidence on the device's safety and performance after its release onto the market. But we're using a single term to encapsulate both of those in the context of this seminar. And of course, PMCF is a form of ongoing clinical evidence generation, so falls under the principles in this section. Alongside MDR Annex 15, the ISO standard 14155/2020 sets out rules and expectations for generating clinical evidence in relation to medical devices. And like the other ISO standards we've mentioned in this talk, is well worth owning a copy of. Of course, when it comes to clinical evidence generation, there are a number of other considerations as well. Some examples include ethics and ethics approval, patient consent, the general data or the GDPR, animal welfare, and any local rules in different countries that relate to how clinical evidence is generated. An important thing to think about is who will collect the data that you need to assimilate, and is the design optimized to appeal to those people? At Mantra Systems, what we do is we bring real medical professionals to the generation of clinical evidence on medical devices. So as a team, we've worked on the other side of this process. We've been the ones who've been asked to collect data. And with the explosion in requirements for PMCF studies, clinicians are going to be inundated with requests to collect data on different medical devices. And the best designs are those that will go ahead. Clinicians haven't got time for cumbersome data entry systems with too many data points and so on. So ensuring you have an optimized clinical evidence or clinical investigation is really, really important, more so than ever before. So let's talk about some failure points. We hinted at a couple there. These are things that generally people get wrong in terms of designing clinical studies on medical devices. Perhaps the most common failure is to have too many data points, trying to get a study to do too many things. This is where going through the workflow that we talked about in this seminar can be really useful because it allows you to hone in on those that are really, really important. What do you need for your risk management? What do you need for clinical evaluation? Coupled to that is a cumbersome data entry process. We still come across companies that are using paper case report forms rather than electronic systems. Paper goes missing. It's often, people don't often have a pen. Remember that a lot of clinicians now will use electronic records for patients. So use of paper is on the decline. Cumbersome data entry systems are a real barrier. Trying to follow up patients for too long. Again, it just predisposes to the risk that patients or subjects will simply drift away, leaving you with data gaps to address at the back end. Have a sensible follow-up period that's realistic is the message. Failure to account for approval and onboarding processes. You can have the best study in the world, but it will still take time in order for hospitals and clinical sites to approve that study and allow you to start running it at their site. And so accounting for that is an important part of the design process. A failure to have something to account for missing data is also common. No study will have 100% compliance with data recording. There will always be some data gaps. It's necessary to have something in place to make sure you can deal with that. Not thinking about technical documentation is something else. Concerns about data security, very important under the GDPR. How will the study and the systems that support it ensure that patient data is held securely and safely? And then issues about consent, and very importantly, as we talked about before, the perspective of the clinician or the subject that will be involved in the study. So that's generating clinical evidence. Now let's think about interpreting clinical evidence through the process of literature review. Again, another vital part of working with the MDR. This is really, we're talking about identification, appraisal, and analysis of clinical data. So finding it, asking whether it's any good and suitable for consideration and to what extent, and then actually considering it in the process of analysis and determining what it tells you about the device and its safety. And this has applications in all sorts of places and across the MDR strategy. So clinical evaluation, which we're going to come on to in a moment, but also early on, looking at your competitors and the state of the art. What do they do? What are they good at? What are they bad at? Where are the opportunities? Independent evidence relating to your device once it's been on the market is really an invaluable source of information to any published literature in relation to your products. Post-market surveillance is part of clinical literature, so that also needs to be considered. And clinical literature is important when it comes to putting together a number of different technical documents that are required. The key thing is objectivity, transparency, and reproducibility. So objectivity isn't always easy when it's your own product, but it's more important than ever before under the MDR compared to the MDD. Reproducibility simply means that you need to document how a clinical literature review has been performed such that that document could be given to somebody else and they could perform fundamentally the same review using your documented method as a recipe. There's a link at the bottom there to talk about our clinical evaluation service. By extension of our clinical evaluation service, we do offer a clinical literature review service where you get a dedicated healthcare professional, medical professional, to perform that literature review for you. Again, a few failure points in relation to clinical literature reviews. Failure to really be objective, that's probably the biggest one, the biggest challenge. Inadequate documentation of protocols, lack of reproducibility, but also accidentally including duplicate data or duplicate sources, inadequate or insufficient appraisal of data sources, failure to cover all applications or indications for the device, and starting too late. If you have a pre-market product, now is the time to consider an initial clinical literature review, at least of the state of the art relating to your device. And finally, that brings us to clinical evaluation. And this is really the bringing together of all the bits that we've spoken about throughout this webinar. There's a long definition of clinical evaluation in the MDR, but ultimately it's about the following areas. It's the structured evaluation of clinical evidence to determine, does the device conform with the relevant MDR Annex 1 general safety performance requirements? Is it suitable for its intended purpose? Does it have an acceptable benefit risk profile? And does it perform adequately compared with safety and performance benchmarks determined on a literature review of the state of the art? They're the central questions for clinical evaluation. And we met this slide at the very beginning, and you can now see that clinical evaluation funnels information from all of the other regulatory systems, plus clinical evidence that you as a manufacturer have generated, plus clinical evidence out there in the world, in the literature. A clinical evaluation report compiles the findings of clinical evaluation at a single point in time. And on the slide, you can see a spine or a framework for going through clinical evaluation or building a clinical evaluation report. And it mirrors some of the workflow that we've considered throughout this webinar. The first three, is it a medical device? What risk class is it in? And what are the relevant general safety performance requirements? Will stem directly from consideration of the device itself. When we consider competitor safety and performance, we're looking at clinical evidence to establish benchmarks against which we're going to assess the subject device. When we're thinking about the subject device and evidence that relates to it, we're talking about the four areas we mentioned before. For both of those two, we need some data. So for the competitors, it will come from a systematic literature review. And for the subject device, it will also come from a systematic literature review, but any evidence that's been generated. And we talked about the interaction between different processes before. That evidence will come from post-market surveillance, PMCF, clinical investigations, vigilance, and risk management. And building all that together and analysing it in the right way, we can draw conclusions in relation to the clinical evaluation of the device. Clinical evaluation is not easy, and writing clinical evaluation reports is demanding and requires a good level of expertise and skill. So at Mdr Systems, we offer two types of service. Our most common service is our CER writing service, where we do a full CER writing service for you. We write clinical evaluation reports and plans, and we allocate to you a subject matter expert who's familiar with the field in which your device operates. We offer complete alignment with requirements for clinical evaluation in the MDR, as well as the latest guidelines that are published independently. As we said before, direct access to a subject matter expert, and we commit to a 6-week turnaround, which includes ample time for reviews between yourselves and our experts. For those of you that are more confident and would like to write a CER in-house but need more information about how to structure it, we do offer a very detailed CER template, which is 57 pages long, which gives line-by-line guidance on exactly how to produce MDR standard CERs. So we've gone all the way through the workflow, and at the end, once we're confident as a manufacturer we have everything in place, we can issue a declaration of conformity, and we can then go forward to a notified body if we need to, or for a Class 1 device to self-certify and apply a CE mark to the device. So it's difficult, but onerous as it may appear, the MDR can offer distinct advantages because it's an incentive to produce and organise clinical evidence. It has to be done. So this, the implementation of the MDR is a great catalyst to producing quality clinical evidence that has the right data points. And as we talked about before, it gives a structured comparison to your competitors and can highlight opportunities for commercial exploitation if done properly. It's a barrier to entry, which means that Me Too products are less likely to find their way through to market. A slightly onerous regulatory process is a real barrier to opportunists out there that try and copy successful products. So once you're through it, it's a great competitive barrier. We haven't talked about Brexit very much, but the short message is that the MDR will be seamlessly accepted in the UK until October 2023. And after that time, we don't yet know exactly what will happen. The MDR standard is more closely aligned with the FDA standards, and performing PMCF properly enables you to build closer links with product users because you need to engage them as part of that process. And again, that can help cement them as a customer and as a friend to your company. So we're going to close just with a couple of words about us as a company. We do things a bit different to our competitors, and the main thing is we try to keep things simple. In this seminar, we've talked about the whole MDR. We tried to decant it into simple terms and to offer you access to a range of support, most of which is available for free on our website. So we have a very clear offering with a very targeted focus. And we're also very personal, so you get direct contact with an allocated medical expert in the event that you work with us. And our experts are real medical professionals who have decades of experience working directly with clinical evidence. And that's both interpreting and generating clinical evidence. So they give a unique insight on the design of studies and making them appeal to the end user. And they're also expert medical writers. In short, we give direct support where it's needed most. And through our academy, we're aiming to empower you to do things yourself where we think that will be in your best interest, both commercially and personally. And finally, just a couple of words about our PMCF survey, PMCF service. We offer a range of different PMCF services, from medical device registries to PMCF surveys, and we aim to offer the full service, so from the earliest stages of design through technical documents and the data collection system itself, and also supporting site onboarding, ethical approval committee applications, and study maintenance. And there's a link to our PMCF services at the bottom of the page. And similarly, we talked about our clinical evaluation service. We can offer writing of CERs, clinical evaluation plans on any device type, and we have experience across the industry. One of the great things about working with independent medical professionals is the requirements for objectivity, subject matter expertise, and detailed appraisal and analysis are almost automatically met, and you get access to a professional medical writer. And finally, we won't go through this in detail, but when you get a copy of the slides from this webinar, it will contain this one, which will be direct links to our different ranges of supports, resources, and services in relation to MDR compliance.